way to the future, and we appreciate it. Today's topic, climate and environmental policy in Japan and the United States, can't be more relevant or crucial. As the leader of Japan society, I know that we also have a role to play in the global response to the impacts of climate change. We are committed to offering programs that address environmental policy, including climate change, as well as starting the process to understand and address our own carbon footprint. Tonight's discussion is further evidence of this commitment. After 8 years, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC, released a report in August that raised an existential alarm, what the writers of that report called a code red for humanity. We're already experiencing higher heat, hurricanes, flash floods, wildfires, and droughts. But as a father of 2 small children, I fear for what their future will hold if today's situation is already this dire. As 2 of the largest carbon emitters on the globe, we are here today to better understand how the Japanese and the US governments will respond to the IPCC report. Since the report informs us that we have only 10 years to make drastic changes, how can governments respond with the requisite urgency given political cycles? Goals for 2030 need to be put into practice today. Even those set for 2050, which is 29 years from now, will affect my children when they may be considering their own families. Will we see the necessary reductions in greenhouse gas emissions, improvement in air quality, and prevention of global temperature increases to avert disaster? While there are no simple answers, Japan Society has invited our esteemed panelists who can point us in the right direction tonight. But before I turn you over to our esteemed panelists, let me thank our sponsors for business and policy. Our global leader, Citi. Corporate partners, Deloitte, Mizuho Americas, Toyota Motor North America. And now let me introduce our moderator. I'd like to turn things over to Dr. Carolyn Kasan. She is Academic Director and Clinical Professor of Global Affairs and Global Security, Conflict, and Cybercrime at New York University's Center for Global Affairs and a leading expert on the geopolitics of energy, environment and resource security, and climate change. Welcome, Dr. Kasan.
Well, thank you so very much. I am absolutely delighted to be here. It is always a privilege and a pleasure to do events at the Japan Society. I'm a big fan of your work, and having lived in Japan, it's always nice to reconnect. But I am just so delighted also to be joined today by 4 fantastic experts who are really going to shed light on environmental climate policy, what's happening at both the corporate and the governmental sectors. It's been a really big week for many of us. If you're here in New York, it's the UN General Assembly. It's Climate Week. We've had many big announcements from different governments, the United States included. President Biden making a statement about relentless diplomacy and very much putting climate change front and center. Today, Jake Sullivan as well and Blinken have spoken about the importance of climate change in diplomacy and putting climate change front and center of US foreign policy. Japan and the United States have, are working together, bilateral relationship to address energy and environmental issues. And again, very, very lucky to be here today with our 4 panelists. So let me go ahead and introduce them, and then we'll jump in. And I've asked each of our panelists to provide a few minutes of overview. We're very lucky to have experts from both, as I said, the corporate space, as well as academia and government. So let me start with Audrey Choi. Audrey is Chief Sustainability Officer of Morgan Stanley. Thank you, Audrey, for being with us. Naoko Ishii, who is Professor, Institute for Future Initiatives, the University of Tokyo. She's also Director, Center for Global Commons, and she's the former CEO and Chairperson of Global Environmental Facility. And Miho Kurosaki, Head of Japan and Korea Research, Bloomberg New Energy Finance. And finally, Melanie Nakagawa, Special Assistant to the President and Senior Director for Climate and Energy, National Security Council, the White House. Again, thank you all so very much for being here. So let's jump in. I know we have a big audience tonight and they're here to hear all of you. So Melanie, if you wouldn't mind getting us started, would love, again, you've had a really busy week, and I know you said tomorrow is a busy day ahead, lots of things coming out of the US government. So I'd love to get your perspective.
Sure, happy. Thank you so much for inviting me here today. It's really fantastic, and I really appreciate being invited to speak to such a great group. And really, hopefully, we get some good questions during the Q&A portion, because that always makes these conversations even more interactive in this virtual world. So we've had a fantastic week, a really exciting week, a perfect time for actually having this conversation. It's UN General Assembly week in New York. President Biden spoke, as you mentioned, on Tuesday, and he spoke about how the climate crisis is a code red for humanity, citing what Joshua mentioned, which was that Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change report. I thought Joshua's opening comments were particularly relevant because he's calling on policymakers and governments to talk about what are we doing to showcase what we're doing about the urgency of this crisis. And so with my overly long title that you read out, this short story of what it is really, as an advisor to the National Security Advisor here at the White House, how are we talking about climate change? How are we integrating climate change into our national security and foreign policy? And that's what we'd be happy to talk about today. And what I'm happy to talk about is the fact that since day one, we've been pursuing, from the climate perspective, a three-pronged strategy. First is always get our house back in order. The U.S. has humbly come back to the global stage on climate action by rejoining the Paris Agreement on day one. Within the first 100 days, President Biden hosted a leader summit on climate, where we amassed over 55% of the global economy, put forward targets aligned with that 1.5 to Joshua's call to action. Over more than half the economy put forward those targets, including the United States. We announced a 50 to 52% reduction in our emissions by 2030, which is 1.5 degree aligned. In addition to getting our house back in order, it's about taking this on the road. It's about showcasing and exercising our global leadership. And this includes President announcing that John Kerry, former Secretary of State, hopefully well known to many of you, a climate champion, as a special presidential envoy, who's been traveling the world and speaking with world leaders and governments about what we all can do collectively to marshal our actions to tackle climate ambition with policies and actions in this decisive decade. The third part of our strategy is about how we multilateralize this effort. Because as much as what we can do at home, we're only 15% of global emissions. 85% of emissions actually come from the rest of the world. And so while we're deeply committed to what we're doing domestically, we know that we have to work with partners and allies around the world in keeping the 1.5 degree Celsius target within reach. And that's really our global objective as we head into this really quick sprint, just a short 5 weeks before the UN climate conference in Glasgow, Scotland, called the COP26. And so really between now and then, it really is the sprint to see how do we bring other countries alongside with us. It's about marshaling finance. President Biden announced on Tuesday to double our commitment to international climate finance. And we've got some experts in finance on this panel today, so I'm sure we'll talk more about how you marshal more capital. But from a public sector dollar perspective, which is a key part of the effort, but not nearly enough, but a key part of it, we've put forward our most ambitious target to date around finance. And now it's about how do you leverage more private capital to get us going towards the 100 billion goal we all have committed to by 2025, if not sooner. So it's really about get our house in order, which we are doing and doing strong. It's about taking this on the road and exercising our global leadership through different types of commitments. And then it's about multilateralizing that effort. And so really excited to have this discussion and just wanted to kick it off with a few thoughts. So thank you for that.
Well, thank you, Melanie. Lots of questions from what you just shared, so I'll come back to those. We're going to move on to Miho Kurosaki. I just want to let you know that Miho will not have her video on. She's experiencing some internet problems. It wouldn't be a Zoom without some internet challenges, but Miho, over to you.
Thank you, Caroline. Thanks for having me today. Apologies again that I won't be able to show my face today, but I'm Miho Kurosaki. I'm representing Bloomberg NEF. We are no longer Bloomberg New Energy Finance. We sort of started covering many things, not just new energy finance. So we are now Bloomberg NEF. Bloomberg NEF is essentially a research division within Bloomberg. We focus on decarbonization, climate change, and from policy to economics to technologies to consumers to sustainable finance. finance. So we cover so many different things when it comes to climate change. When you look at the sort of emission pie in greenhouse gas emissions, you have electricity as the biggest chunk, and then you have transport, buildings, industry, and agriculture. And Bloomberg really covers everything when it comes to sector decarbonization pathway to net zero. So that's what we do. I'm sort of representing today for Japan. I used to cover Japan and Korea research. Now I'm actually doing head of ESG for APAC within Bloomberg NEF. We try to contextualize climate change and decarbonization for financial professionals in APAC. But together with NAOCO, I'm part of the climate change expert panel for Prime Minister offices in Japan. As you know, Prime Minister Suga announced carbon neutrality goal back in October, which is now legislated, become effective from April next year. And then in April this year, 2021, as part of the Climate Leaders Summit in the US, hosted by President Biden, Japan revised the 2030 emission reduction goal, which is now 46% compared to 2013 level, which is 20% percentage points up from the previous NDC target, which is a significant sort of improvement. But we think, according to Bloomberg NEF's analysis, which is that the target itself is sort of between a 1.5 degrees pathway, not nearly 1.5 yet, but fairly above 2.0 pathway. So which is a great milestone compared to last year. And then as part of the climate change experts panel, we have seen how Prime Minister Suga has been committed to climate change, and he's the one pledged carbon neutrality goal. He's the one made the change in the 2030 emission reduction goal, and now he's sort of supporting carbon pricing, which I know we will be discussing later. But so he's the one, so I really appreciate his leadership in climate change. And as many of you know that he is sort of stepping down, and we will welcome new Prime Minister soon. I really hope, the new Prime Minister will succeed this sort of, this momentum and keep, this climate change goal moving forward. However, there are so many different sort of policies coming up. A notable example is basic energy policy, which was put out already as a draft version. And then climate change strategy policy also came out already. There are sort of lots of pros and cons. And then I must say that we will have to take a closer look at the details of these policies, and because it's really affecting corporate behaviors, corporations. We know that there are already 214 companies, Japanese companies, have pledged net zero, which is fascinating. However, when you look at the details of the net zero, there are so many different levels of commitment, whether it includes Scope 3 emissions, whether it has an interim target, whether it's in line with science-based target. So they're nitty-gritty part of the net zero pathways, but I really appreciate his leadership, but also how corporations are reacting to it. So thank you for having me, and really looking forward to the discussion.
Excellent. Well, thank you so very much, Miho. So I'm going to pass it over to Audrey. Audrey is at Morgan Stanley, Chief Sustainability Officer. Audrey.
Great, thank you so much, Carolyn. And it's really great to be here at the Japan Society and with such a great power panel. So thank you for the opportunity. I would just say from the business perspective, I would make three quick points. The first is that what we have seen over the last decade has been a fundamental, complete sea change in how investors and corporate leaders are regarding climate change. It was actually 12 years ago in 2009 that I founded the Global Sustainable Finance Group at Morgan Stanley, starting our business focus on sustainable investing. And when I think back to that time in 2009, the most frequent question I got was, what is sustainable investing and why is Morgan Stanley doing it? And is that just part of marketing or corporate social responsibility or philanthropy? And people really thought about climate change as an environmental issue that was not core, right? And you fast forward to today, where suddenly everyone has realized that climate change is fundamental to business continuity, to returns, to risk management. And I have to say, you know, that one of the most amazing partners I've had at the entire firm at Morgan Stanley has actually been our Chief Risk Officer, Keishi Hotsuki, who has really embraced climate change risk as a critical stripe in the risk model. And so I think that represents a fundamental shift and is part of why, you know, sustainable investing, again, when we started 12 years ago, it was less than 10% of the market of investors who said they wanted to understand and think about environment in their investing. It's now a $30 trillion market in terms of ESG. So people have really understood that it's critical, and that frankly, I would be hard pressed to name a single investment that you could choose that would be completely unaffected by climate change. So that's thing one. Thing two that I think has really changed in the understanding of climate change is that people have understood that environmental issues, social issues, and governance issues are actually all connected, right? As recently as, frankly, just, you know, pre-pandemic, and recently as 2 years ago, I would often have conversations with investors where they would say, okay, Audrey, well, I'm an E investor, so tell me what you got in low carbon. Or I'm an S investor. I care about social issues, gender strategy, and then others would say, I'm just a good governance type, right? Leave the environment stuff to others, but I'm an E or an S or G. And when the pandemic first broke out, people were like, okay, Audrey, now people don't care about E or S or G. They just care about Clorox wipes and, you know, and provisions and ultimately a vaccine. And now people have understood that, frankly, again, these are all connected, right? Climate change, a warming planet, has actually made the Earth a much more hospitable place for infectious disease, right? Under a business as usual scenario, we're looking at more than 1 billion people, predominantly in Europe and North America, who will be exposed to infectious tropical diseases like malaria, dengue, yellow fever. And if we were to achieve the Paris goals, that additional 1 billion people exposed to those diseases would be limited to only 500 million. So we're still talking massive sea changes in public health because of climate change. And of course, there's an enormous, we could spend a whole hour talking about climate justice and the impact on low-income communities globally and domestically from climate change. So the second is it's connected. Third, I would just say that increasingly also people have realized, or should realize, that in as much as these climate discussions so often seem so dire and disastrous and depressing, that there's also enormous opportunity, right? And in corporate conversations, when I'm talking with CEOs or with investors, I say, look, you really have to understand that thinking about climate change is not only good risk management. The company, the investor that is best able to figure out the alternative, whether that's alternative energy, the alternative workflow processes, they are going to have a leap on innovation, on productivity, on competitiveness, and also they're going to win market share, because increasingly consumers, client, and in the war for talent, you know, everyone is voting with their feet that they really do care about the impact that they're having, and you cannot get away from that without destroying brand value. And then finally, I would just say this panel I think is perfect, because none of us can do any of this if it's not a collaboration between enlightened policy to set the rules of the road, to enable and accelerate the flow of finance, and with researchers like Naoko and others to really help us show the way, understand the science, understand how to apply that to our business and investment models, so that investors can make entirely rational financial choices that also align with the enlightened policy direction that we need to go, so that we can avoid that code red situation. So really excited for the conversation, Carolyn.
Well, thank you so very much. You're really helping to lay the foundation, and it's a great start. So I'm going to hand it over to Naoko from the University of Tokyo. So we have the academic perspective as well.
Yeah, thank you so much. I'm so actually pleased to be a part of this panel, because and you have been hearing the three powerful women that I think the most of the important points are already actually presented. Actually, before I took this position as the professor and the director for Center for Global Commons at the University of Tokyo, as you kindly introduced that I worked for the Global Environment Facility as CEO for 80 years in Washington. And during that time, my sense is that, okay, the world has been changing, and as many of you have already said, it's a sea change that's massive. And I was always wondering where Japan is, and then Prime Minister Suga's announcement of the last October that we declare that we also commit to the net zero by 2050, and we are in. That really relieved me so much, and at least we are part of this this club, a net zero club. And then, as Miho already said, I really appreciated the Prime Minister's leadership to make that announcement or to make that decision. It's a little bit of out of blue, to be absolutely honest with you. There hasn't been much discussion internally in Japan, either at the government or the business or even academia. Yes, there are the people who are exposed to what's going on externally do understand that this may be something they should also do, but there wasn't a kind of massive the consensus going forward. So this the announcement by Prime Minister was really triggering a huge sea change in Japanese community, but it also means that the Japanese community really didn't have much time to come up with a detailed plan that how to get there, detailed pathway to how to achieve either 2030 or 2050. So the vision was set, or the goal was set, but then even as of today, we have been really busy to come out with a very kind of detailed and practical pathway going forward. So that as Miho said, that there are quite a number of announcements and the policies here and there, but do they really adapt to the big picture to give that the credible pathway to achieve 2030 or 2050? I have to say it really has to be worked out, and it reflects a little bit of short time to prepare ourselves to go there, because it's such a massive change. And I think that Joshua started by saying it's environmental policy. No, it's not the environmental policy. It's a long-term business and societal structural change, and it really needs a total transformation of our economic and societal system. So it's not something we can work out that quickly. It really needs the huge exercise, and we are doing that. So that is maybe my one of my points. And just ending by saying that we are at a very interesting time of the GA, the General Assembly, and going to COP26. And this is really a litmus test that if this collaboration, international collaboration, really works or not. That my center, the Global Commons Center, is trying to identify what's the best mechanism to govern the global commons like climate change, but also the vaccination. COVID-19 is another global commons. And we are, to be honest, miserably failing to show the world that we really don't have the effective mechanism to govern the global commons. So the litmus test is there, that can we really work together to manage this huge challenge and opportunities. I think, as Audrey said, that but it really requires the full-fledged, very deep global collaboration, and the US and Japan can play a huge role there, but it really needs to be worked out. Thank you.
Well, thank you so very much. So I'm going to ask my first question to Melanie. So Melanie, you laid out, the United States is in a very different position in 2021 than it was a year ago in 2020. The Biden administration has very much, came out of the gate making climate change a whole of government endeavor. So I'm curious as to how you see that connection between climate change and national security. You sit in the NSC, and how is that going to be sort of positioned going into COP26?
Great, thank you. Yes, it is a sea change. As a whole of government, in terms of the whole of government approach, I'd say there's sort of three ways that it manifests itself, especially on the national security and foreign policy side. The first is this statement followed by action of what does it mean to make climate change a national security and foreign policy priority. And what that means in practice is that we are building habits of cooperation in the international space on talking and elevating climate change as one of those top tier priorities. And so by implementing the strategy, what that means is in pretty much almost every one of President Biden's meetings with other foreign leaders, he's raising climate change issues with his counterpart, which means his counterpart has to be ready to talk about what they're doing on this, and they're going to be held accountable to make sure that they're putting forward policies and implementing their policies, or at least putting more ambition on the table. And he's doing that everywhere, and that he started that on day one. And so by joining the Paris Agreement, he let the world know we're coming back and we want to follow this international order when it comes to target setting and following up on your target and making sure that the world knows how we're doing the methodology around that. If you take a look at just this short year alone, so we're in September at this point, we started off pretty quick. He had the World Leaders Summit, and then he had the G7 meeting where climate was a key deliverable, and then his early bilateral engagements, which included Prime Minister Suga, included Korea, Mexico, Canada. So in each of those meetings of world leaders, climate was one of the top 3 deliverables in all of those discussions. And now we've got a big meeting tomorrow, which is relevant for today, which is the Quad countries. It's India, Japan, Australia, and the United States. It is the 4 great democracies of the Indo-Pacific. And again, stay tuned, not going to break news here today, but I would expect that climate is one of the key areas of cooperation among these leaders, as it was earlier this year when the Quad met virtually. This will be the first in-person meeting of those countries. And so part of when we say it's, foreign policy, national security priority, what it means is that you're going to see it raised in the security context through Jake Sullivan, our national security advisor, through Secretary Blinken, Department of State. It's no longer a siloed niche issue. And so as Naoko mentioned, this is not environmental policy per se, right? This is economic policy, this is foreign policy. The idea of integrating climate through all these key streams means it's not just for environment ministers, it's for the finance ministers that Naoko worked with, it's for the economic ministers, and it's in the boardrooms that Audrey's talking to as well. And so that's part of how we're embodying that here. It's on Secretary Yellen's agenda in just a few short weeks, as Naoko remembers well. Bank Fund is happening. It's when all the finance experts descend upon Washington, D.C. and cause a lot of traffic by the World Bank. And so Bank Fund is coming, and that is really an area where you're going to see, again, Secretary Yellen putting out into that global space what the finance sector can do on climate action. It should send a signal to people like Audrey of where the financial community, policymakers, and regulators are going when it comes to climate risk and climate integration. But that's another area where you're seeing what does that mean in practice? How does it manifest itself? And then lastly, we have the area of climate security itself. Migration issues, conflict drivers, how we deal with resilience. This year in particular, and last year, extreme weather events. I mean, it's really hard. Unfortunately, you're hard pressed to find any place on the planet not experiencing record-breaking extremes. And that just means the urgency of the crisis is so much more tangible, even if you're not a coastal state or a least developing country. The idea of having, San Franciscan, Californians were looking at an orange sky just, this time last year because of the fires, and it looked like Mars. So I think there's this aspect where no one's left untouched, and so it has a real sort of tangible national security in its purest definition. Our own national security feels impacted by the climate extremes that are happening, and we now know, thanks to the IPCC report, that yet again made an even tighter nexus between carbon dioxide emissions caused by humans that are leading to these extreme weather events that are happening more frequently and more, frankly, more significantly and severe. So the time is, again, we are approaching what we continue to call the decisive decade, 2021, the 2020s. And we're kind of coming into 2021 with what I hope is a lot of optimism that we have a 9-year sprint that is doable, that we can get it done, and that all the world's leaders, whether it's in private sector, academia, or in the public sector, we all recognize that it's now or never, that we really must act. We can't wait any longer. We can't wait for things to be, sort of the perfect is the enemy of the good, but really have this opportunity. And so I think that's what I'm excited about, because I think there really is a national security imperative here, whether it's the Secretary of Defense, who again, early days, he, versus previous administrations, it took a couple of years before you hear the SecDef talking about it. Now, I think it was day 7, we had the executive order, and you get a statement out of Secretary Austin talking about how he is internalizing the climate crisis, which is, you're seeing it across the DoD apparatus. So really, you'd be hard pressed to find a single cabinet member who doesn't have their own charge or mission for what they're going to do on climate. And that, I think, is what's giving us such a much more accelerated urgency from this administration. And you're going to see that across the tables with all of the countries and partners that they sit across from the Raising Climate.
Excellent. Thank you so very much. Yeah, no, it's pretty striking how different, this administration is to the former administration. And it's been, I teach, and for students, it just gives them a lot more hope. It gives them a lot more hope that they can be part of the change, that they can invest themselves and make a difference. So thank you very much for that. So Miho, I'd like to, how is Japan thinking about working with the United States on issues of climate and environment? Maybe another question that I'd like to ask, and you talked about the Suga administration, and that administration will change, the Prime Minister's administration will change. Is there confidence that the next administration will retain and build on the current policies, the robust policies that have been put forward by Japan?
That's a really great questions, are really timely. Let me just first talk about US-Japan collaboration in the area of climate change and environmental policy. I think this is my own personal view. Potentially 3 areas. I know this is also laid out in US-Japan or Japan-US climate partnership, which President Biden and Prime Minister Suga had came out from their dialogue back in April. My view is that sort of technology and subnationals and working towards other Asian nations. So those are the 3 areas. Sort of technology part, probably CCS, CCUS, these really difficult decarbonization technology areas, probably the R&D area that Japan and US can collaborate with. And also some of the questions you laid out is also carbon offsetting or carbon credit certification mechanisms that are quite unknown area at the moment. There are so many voluntary mechanisms in place, and probably Japan and US can work together around decarbonization technology, but also carbon offsetting areas. The second part is I think subnationals and local governments and really citizens really play a really big role in mitigating, and also mitigating climate change, but also climate change adaptation areas. I know US also has a big push on subnationals, and Japan as well now. Minister of Environment is really putting out a lot of efforts on local government net zero city initiatives. I think now already 400 local governments pledged net zero, which is fascinating, and now covering 1 million populations in Japan. So this, initiative is really going well. And then I think, local governments knows, the best sort of areas for renewable energy, project development, but also they have a strong connection with local community. And might be a good, to implement circular economy in the local areas. So I think, this can be a good part, and maybe, Japan and US can probably share a good, examples of, case studies, so that we can learn together. And the third pillar that I said is probably working with Asian nations together between US and Japan. As you know, other Asian nations and have a really growing economy, and also emission is rising. And we have have a really big track record in providing and technology. I shouldn't say it's necessarily environmentally friendly technology, but also previously, Japan has been providing coal power technologies. But I think we can change that strategy. I mean, it's already changing to, exporting environmental technology, including grid, power grid, cables, and renewable energy. But also, I'm a strong believer that Japan has a really good disaster prevention management, disaster prevention planning process in place. And then, as you know, other Asian nations are very vulnerable to climate change. and climate change, physical risks are really big. So maybe Japan can step in, and together with the US, of course, we can provide finance as a sort of aid to these nations, but also we have a lot of solutions around climate change. And then your second part of the question on next administration, it's a really tricky question. There are 4 candidates at the moment, and depending on the candidate, maybe a lot of spotlight was on nuclear policy, and maybe this is an opportunity for me to talk a little bit about nuclear policy at the moment. So the basic energy policy I just briefly talked about was out. It's a draft version of that, the policy, and the nuclear has a 22%, so 20 to 22% of the mix, which has not been changed since 2015. So it's been 6 years. The nuclear target number hasn't been changed, and this is going to be carried on if no one wants to step in to change. It's a political will that requires to change because it really needs to have a robust way to set out nuclear. So in order to achieve this goal, which is a very, very ambitious goal, government needs to have 27 to 30 reactors active. And currently we only have 10 reactors operating and contributing 6% only. So you have a really big basic math. You need to increase 15% or maybe close to 20% generation up to reach this goal. And Bloomberg NEF really expects less than 20 by 2030, just only 12%. Or 13% if the current policy continues. And current policy is really crucial. Basic energy policy sets out 20 to 22%, but it still carries on the legacy nuclear policy, which is no new build, no new replacement. So if the next prime minister comes in and to revise the nuclear policy to say to allow a new build or new replacement, then this target can be achievable, but otherwise it's really, really hard to achieve.
Well, thank you so much, and thank you for doing such a great job of answering my rather sort of two-edged question. So thank you for that. Audrey, you have been a pioneer. You were 2009 bringing sustainability to the forefront at Morgan Stanley. You've sort of helped bring together the ES and the G, so they're not looked at as sort of separate. Where do you see some of the most significant drivers going forward in the sustainability space? As was pointed out earlier by Melanie, you have movement, a lot more movement happening at the federal financial level. You have, you just have these new drivers. You have the public, you have movements that are seeking companies to be more responsible, whether it be around their environmental footprint and carbon, around social issues, around governance. So how is, maybe from your vantage point, what do you see as the sort of the ways to kind of go from where we are to maybe where we need to be across the corporate landscape?
Well, I think that, as I said, among the reasons that I'm actually optimistic, despite the incredibly challenging situation that we're in, is that precisely as you and as Melanie said, we're in a moment now where there has really been this sort of full stakeholder mobilization, right? Where whether it's individuals and clients or the next gen of talent or regulators or corporate leaders, that finally everyone has realized this incredible imperative towards action now. And I think what has especially helped on the investor side is that people have also increasingly seen the alignment of what is necessary, what is right, but also what is profitable, either because it is good risk management or because it is a good opportunity. And that has been, I think, part of why you now see this $30 trillion worth of investing flooding towards sustainable solutions. And so, I think that, but even more than that, and again, because we are having a global conversation here, I think that people have increasingly started to understand that being sort of climate forward, again, is not about being, bleeding edge green. It is fundamentally not only, and is also not only about survival, it really is about international competitiveness. Right. And I think that, it's an amazing impetus for change of everything that, Melanie and the Biden administration and the full cabinet is doing. That is incredible. But I think we have to also, remember that, the NGFS, right, the Network for Greening the Financial System over the past number of years has accumulated something like 80 central banks around the world aligning, saying that climate is a fundamental risk to financial stability, and that this needs to be part of our governance structure globally. And so I think as a result of that, when you combine NGFS, and we were so excited that the US Fed also joined, shortly after the election, even before inauguration, which was a very interesting timing there, that what it means is that this really is an imperative. And when you're having these incredible powerful forces for change of regulators, policy leaders, investors, and the citizenry all aligning towards this. And so how does that land for corporates and for investors? I think it's a couple of things that we've seen really accelerating in the past couple of months and years. One is obviously corporate pledges about climate change, right? It seems like every day there's some new Fortune 500 or Fortune 1000 company pledging to be net zero by 2050. It's unclear how many companies know what that actually means and how they will actually do it. But I'm a firm believer that intention precedes action, right? And declarations are needed to mobilize. So I think it's incredibly exciting that, if the corporations are declaring that they're going to be net zero by 2050, whatever that means for them. Secondly, though, we really have seen money starting to move to follow that, right? So if you think about the green bond market, since 2008, there's been actually $1 trillion of financing through green bonds. But I think one of the things that's really significant about it from an investor perspective is in the early years. So we worked with the IFC in 2012-13 to do the first ever $1 billion green bond. Before that, they'd been much smaller, $50 million, $100 million, not benchmark size, not institutionally sort of worth noticing. But once you have that $1 billion one, but in those early years, we would spend a lot of time convincing the corporation, why don't you try a green bond? It would be great. And here's what's great about it. And so often you would get a CFO saying, why would I want to do that? I have no problem going to the markets and raising money. I don't need a green bond. I don't need the extra paperwork. I don't need some nonprofit to certify what I'm doing. I don't care. Why would I want to do that? Oh, wait, are you just saying it's a marketing thing? If it's a marketing thing, I don't know, maybe. And now, though, what you've seen is, as you've seen investors saying, no, I am interested in debt from this company if and only if it is going towards the climate transition, you have actually seen a number of things happen. You've seen the spreads narrow. You've seen those issuances be far more oversubscribed than the vanilla issuances. And suddenly the CFOs are saying, oh, it actually helps me do my job better financially to do that green bond. And so you now have this real explosion of green bonds. So that's great. I would say that the most, I think, meaningful thing is when green bonds are just the tip of the iceberg indicator that a company has started really thinking about their entire strategy, their supply chain, their manufacturing procedures, their distribution models, their packaging, their recycling, their end of use, their responsibility for the entire life cycle analysis of their products and services. And when you have CEOs being truly enlightened about that, that's what I think causes this enormous, force for change. And that's what then I think really brings it to, what I think is nirvana, which is when you would eventually have every corporation having that full C-suite approach, just the way Melanie was talking about that full cabinet approach, right? Where the chief legal officer says, if every regulator that I, do business in their jurisdiction, to every regulator is care about climate, I need to care about climate. Every chief risk officer should be like our chief risk officer, understand it as a basic stripe. The business units need to understand that they will lose or gain money, market share, and assets under management based on it. And the chief marketing officer realizes that their brand is going to rise or fall. So, that's where I think we are. And I think the mobilization of business and investors figuring out the right ways to align climate action with reduced risk and increased profit is how we hopefully can get the business flywheel to help us out of this.
Excellent. Thank you. I loved. So I'm just going to a quick question in response to your comments. So when do we get to nirvana? Is it?
Well, again, I don't have the crystal ball, but here's my sign of, here's my hope, and this I will credit with my former boss Al Gore, who at this moment in time very often quotes the great economist Rudy Dornbush, right, which is that oftentimes change takes far longer to begin than you would ever have dreamed possible. But once it starts, it moves faster than you ever would have imagined. And I do believe that having, sort of watched the space where for a lot of the last 10 years, it really was like, pushing water uphill, we've suddenly gotten to the hockey stick. And I think right now, we're seeing people can't kind of figure out fast enough how to do this. So look, we'll have some missteps along the way. We will have some places where declarations may outstrip ambition and ambition will outstrip action. But at least we're moving in the right direction, I believe, I hope.
I'm hopeful too. So thank you. Thank you for that. I appreciate your optimism. It's wonderful. So Naoko, so Audrey just laid out a picture for us in terms of, what corporates in the United States, again, not all, but many, in terms of how they're moving forward, how government regulation and policies are helping to move that. What do you see in Japan from the way that corporations, the private sector, is responding to these, to the new demands, to climate change that's impacting Japan, that's climate change that's impacting supply chains that many corporations depend on. I'd be curious to get a sense from you as to what that looks like from from a corporate perspective in Japan.
Yeah, sure. Thank you. Yeah, just before I answer to your question, I just want to say to Audrey that what you said about 3 steps, like the climate change, the solution to climate change is actually needed, it's possible, and it's desirable. Those 3 points I was actually hearing to Al Gore, who preached us so long, and it seems it's coming out now, so that we are very happy to hear those 3 steps together. And as you said, it's actually that it's not the environmental policy, it's an international competitiveness strategy, and that's why I think that the Japanese business people are getting it and actually trying to work out. And as Miho said, and more companies are declaring their own strategy to get there. However, in order for them to really materialize what they are promising or committing, I actually think that the role of the government is very, very important. So as I mentioned, that this 2050 commitment is actually that announced a little bit out of blue, and we are very busy in actually that figuring out how to get there. There's an industrial strategy, it's a long-term economic planning, and then the nitty-gritty needs to be worked out. However, fundamentally, what is missing, or is still missing, is this long-term vision from the government and how the economic system may change in terms of the pricing, in terms of the policy, in terms of actually the investment. Nick Stern, we all know that this author of The Cost of Inaction, 2006, is now producing a lot of paper for G20, and very clearly lay out that the G7 countries may need about 2% of the GDP equivalent investment for the next 20, 30 years if we are serious to get there. So that and he very clearly lay out which is a part of the government, which is a part of the private, and what is the area that the collaboration work best. So that kind of strategy and that kind of detailed investment plan, together with pricing strategy, really lay out the foundation for companies to materialize and their commitment. And to me, that is a bit of the missing as of today, particularly on Japanese side. So I think what we need to see is this, the government much more full-fledged, the longer term, the planning, the strategy, and also the collaboration with the private sector, because what we need to see is a total system change, and then where the R&D should go to, and what are the kind of sectoral strategy and industrial strategy, because this issue will not go away, as we all know, because science is telling us that we have to find a way to get there. And in Japan, I'm hearing a lot of kind of unhappiness or the reluctance and some kind of blame that, oh, this is all about European conspiracy. I'm telling them it's not a conspiracy, it's really the science. And so that if we listen to the science and the scientific message, we have to find a way to work it out. And that is actually that what we need to see is this collaboration between the public and the public policy, and actually that the private sector investment plan together to work it out. And just about the importance of transition. Yes, that now that the longer term goal is set and we are working all about the transition, and it's I welcome this and the huge appetite of the investors and the consumers to get the green. However, I see a little bit of this kind of confusion what exactly the ESG means, and then who is really recognizing or certifying or giving okay mark to this and their transition plan. I think that there's some kind of scientific and the kind of mechanism needs to be created to really help the steer that those funds to go to the right place in the right way. What I think we need to see is it's institutionalized or systematized those funds and then the initiative into the right way. As Audrey mentioned, this announcement by the NGFS is great because that is the effort to systematize, institutionalize those appetite, at least at the financial sector. So back to you.
Excellent. Thank you so very much. We're getting a lot of great questions from our audience. So thank you to everyone out there asking questions. So we're going to start to integrate them here. But before I do, Mio, I have a question for you. You know, Japan has announced carbon neutrality by 2050. How do you see the non-power sectors, such as, industrial and steel sectors, which are, recognized as being very hard to electrify? How does BNEF see the opportunities for decarbonization in those much harder to decarbonize sectors?
Yeah, absolutely. I think these sectors are really critical in achieving the last sort of 10%, 20% of the emissions, to be net zero. And, when we see in Japan, domestically, these heavy emitting sectors have already, committed to carbon neutrality goal. The level of commitment, again, differs by companies and sectors. Probably the more upstream, the bigger commitments is. And the race is actually already happening, right, in the supply chains or zero carbon product side. And then when you think about supply chains, for example, like Fortescue Metals in Australia, which is a producer of coking coal. And as you can imagine, coking coal is used in the steel industry, still is used by auto companies and many other products. And when these sort of upstream companies pledging net zero, that really means the suppliers will really have to think about transitioning their strategy towards climate change. And then on the sort of zero emission product side, again, the race is already happening. The green steel, green aluminum, green cements, BloombergNEF has been analyzing the economics already, and economics shows that fossil fuel-based products, the incumbent products, sometimes is already expensive than the clean products, sort of zero carbon products. Maybe not now for some sectors, but in the near future for sure. So, for example, in making steel, electric arc furnace is an electrification manufacturing way of making steel. Supplied by clean power can be cheaper than some of the conventional technologies. And in the future, renewable sourced hydrogen, which is so-called green hydrogen, can be a sort of critical part of making these heavy emitting sectors be carbon neutral. And the green hydrogen, again, is really crucial. But when I come back to the domestic discussion on hydrogen in Japan, again, Japan has been leading in the hydrogen discussion for a long time. And however, the green hydrogen production discussion is not so much, unfortunately. There a lot of discussions around importing hydrogen, whether it's green or blue or gray, is a lot of focus at the moment. However, as you can imagine, importing hydrogen doesn't really, replace fossil fuel imports. Again, it's an energy security issues, and Japan really needs to think about, producing hydrogen, green hydrogen, in Japan. Otherwise, energy security issues has not been solved. And in order to produce green hydrogen, as you can imagine, we need to deploy more renewables in Japan, and not necessarily procuring for power demand, but also, to produce, hydrogen when the demand is low, or when the supplies, when we have excessive supply, and so on. So again, hydrogen is a key part in meeting a carbon neutrality goal for these heavy emitting sectors. But I think when you think about hydrogen, you really need to have a holistic view, or robust roadmap when it comes to hydrogen production, hydrogen shipping, hydrogen transport and storage, and then again demand. And according to analysis, importing hydrogen, even in it's green hydrogen from Chile or Australia, which is supposed to be the cheapest source of green hydrogen at the moment, or in the future as well, because renewable energy is cheap. Even importing those hydrogen, you need to convert to ammonia. That then again, you have cost on top of that, and then you have a shipping cost, and then you arrived in Japan. When you convert again back to hydrogen from ammonia, costs a lot. So green hydrogen, domestic green hydrogen in Japan is actually cheaper than importing green hydrogen. I stop here. Back to you, Caroline.
Thank you so very much. Thanks for that excellent response. So Melanie, I have a question. I'm going to take sort of two questions from the audience. And this, I think gets at what is the United States doing in terms of helping other countries, especially in the developing world, to fund the energy transition. So poorer countries often have little choice but to rely on non-environmentally friendly methods of economic power, energy, coal, oil, gas. That change requires money that they may not have. So how is the US sort of thinking about funding climate risk and funding the energy transition? There's another question, and again, I'm just going to try to connect it, is this issue of global justice and this idea of debt for climate. And this member of the audience says that the Argentine government supports this, but how do you see the United States position around this idea of global environmental justice and how they will help to fund and support the energy transition in countries that are still seeking energy security and deeper energy access?
Great, thank you. So it's a great question, because what I love about it is, especially with this audience, is sort of just to kind of put it in context of where we are in 2021 in terms of market competitiveness of energy technologies and solutions. And so much like Audrey's story about where we were in 2009, where we are today, so much has changed. And one of the things that has changed is, where are the economics behind energy systems? On one hand, there's inertia behind certain systems. There's inertia behind the deals that, Audrey's teammates were doing for the last several decades. But, she's seeing a marked shift of how they're thinking about, it's not just an ESG deal or a green bond. It's not green, it's just a smart bond. It's a bond that's going to have the returns you need. It's a bond that's going to meet various financial metrics. Oh, and it happens to also increase resilience. And we now have, through the various kind of task forces on climate risk and disclosure, we now realize that that type of resilience actually pays more dividends in the end. So you're not rebuilding that toll bridge or that road multiple times because it's being washed out by a storm, but by investing in a more resilient one, you're actually paying for less recovery and repairs on that particular toll road, and then you're going to make more money off of that project. And so I put that in context because when it comes to clean energy, I would argue the premise of the question, which posits that coal and fossil technologies are cheaper in many of these countries, and therefore those are what's being built, I would argue that I would call some of that into question. Are they truly cheaper? Are we actually looking at the right metrics and accounting for what determines cost of that project? Are we actually finding a way to factor in public health lost days of work, sickness and health issues, which now we have much better data and science to incorporate into the economic analysis. And so again, is it truly cheaper? But even just dollar for dollar energy resource, again, is that fossil energy truly cheaper? And maybe it is in some cases. And that could be because policies might actually preference those electrons onto the grid than the clean energy electrons. There could be other biases in the system that prevent the clean energy technologies from actually getting to scale because there's still subsidies, whether direct or indirect subsidies, into that fossil industry that policy and regulation can actually course correct and fix. Or frankly, it truly just is more cost effective to do renewable when you factor it all in. And now you need to get the financial industry to recognize that these are, it may not have the same balance sheet as a coal project or a fossil energy project would, because that has been around for decades. But actually, when you think about it and you look at the current metrics around that project and that deal, the returns are actually quite good and attractive. And we can find a way to think about financial products that'll buy down that risk in the investor's mind to get them to go invest. So one hand is saying that I don't necessarily agree with the premise that fossil energy is cheaper in these countries and that it is the most cost-effective resource for them to go to. Secondly, we're doing more to actually just put more dollars on the table. The U.S. has doubled our double, is what we call it. So we doubled our announcement in April, and then we doubled that double just this past week. So we're doing our share, putting public dollars to work, but ideally those public dollars leverage far more private capital. And that's the conversation with, Audrey's team and others of here, the U.S. government dollar, it is lower cost debt, it is political risk insurance, it is first loss guarantee. How do I package my dollar of government dollar to actually bring more private capital into that project? What else do you need to bring you into the developing world, into emerging markets, where sometimes the private capital mobilization hasn't always occurred? So what are ways that we can entice some of these investors who may shy away from the emerging markets for a variety of reasons? What can we do through policy and public dollars actually encourage them to go after those emerging market opportunities? Now, for the justice question, a truly important one, because again, another real transformation wave that we're in today. One, we're a panel full of women. I think that all of our organizations have had a alertness to the fact that we need more diversity in our ranks, and that's why where we are. I think Naoko broke a lot of ground, being the head of Jeff for quite so many years as a female leader. But I also think that what we've got here is a new awakening around diversity. And so when it comes to equity and diversity and who needs to be at the table for those conversations, that has also changed. I'm so proud that this administration announced something called the Justice 40 initiative. It's a domestic initiative, but it's focused on ensuring that 40% of our public dollars in environment and clean energy go to low income and marginalized communities and communities of color. It's a domestic effort, but I think it plays well in terms of best practice for how we think about the global narrative. So Asian Development Bank, if we think about, again, the audience I'm talking to today, which is Indo-Pacific Asia focused, the Asian Development Bank, working with other private banks, is actually looking at an accelerating coal transition program, where it's actually looking at taking the existing infrastructure of coal. Sometimes the financials around coal projects are not the best, and that's why they're going to multilateral development banks for support and help to make them more solvent or help their financial stress. So now you've got programs out there to say, okay, you'll get access to some of this multilateral money, but only if you do some reform, only if we can use that and actually put that into the transition to cleaner energy systems. And so the United States joined the G7. We put some dollars to work in the Accelerating Coal Transition Program, the Climate Investment Fund. And that's going to go to countries that have raised their hands. So again, it's about the justice and equity issue. We're not coming into countries saying, you go do X or Y. Countries apply for this money saying, we want to do this transition. We see that our current incumbent industry is not producing at the scale it needs to. And we see a whole new future and a clean energy economy that's producing lots of jobs, good paying jobs, and it's a future that's more sustainable and cleaner. We want that. So can you help us get there? How do you help us provide finance for that? So there are programs now like the Accelerating Coal Transition Program that's run out of the World Bank and other related type funds, the Climate Investment Fund. And that's about taking over job worker training, job transition, actually doing the mapping of where would you site these clean energy projects. And then there's some really great innovators and technology players that'll look at the footprint of a coal plant which is actually quite a large physical footprint because of the nature of the health, actually the nature of the physical, the way a plant is sited. And you could put solar there. You could put probably small modular reactors when that's ready and prime time ready for commercial scale. You can do a lot with that physical footprint of a coal plant to provide for the transition to clean energy. And the beauty of it is it's already connected to the grid. So, you know, you're not creating new space, you're not deforesting an area to build a new area. It's actually taking the existing place. You're also avoiding blight, which would be fantastic for many of these communities. So I think that's part of what it is that it's trying to create jobs, meet the worker where the place is, you know, really being awoken to that, and also ensuring that we're doing it that's country driven as well.
Excellent, thank you. And I'm so glad that you pointed out in terms of the way that the cost situation has changed for renewable energy in terms of, you know, used to be that coal was always thought to be cheaper, and now wind and solar are in many ways cheaper than fossil-based energy. So thanks for highlighting that and everything else. Audrey, so a couple questions coming in as well for you. Are investments related to climate change more of a private equity market play as opposed to a public equity? And I'm going to add a question because I want to make sure that we get through as many questions as we can before we have to close. The other question is, what policy, and you've addressed this, but just to, what policy levers can the two governments create to incentivize private companies to institute genuinely sustainable practices and not just greenwashing? That was in the question. So 2 questions about public and private equity and how we, you know, just move things more forward.
Sorry, we had to have at least one "you're muted" moment in the Zoom.
I didn't say it though.
Yeah, in terms of public-private equity, absolutely, there are public equity opportunities as well to have, you know, full climate-focused portfolios that are public equities. I think that is, you know, it was sort of a particular period, you know, maybe 10 years ago, when people thought that the only way you could invest in a climate action-focused way was through a clean tech private equity fund. You certainly could still do that if you want to, but really, there's increasing opportunities to find all sorts of ways to tilt your entire portfolio to be climate forward. One of the things actually that we developed is a tool that we call Morgan Stanley IQ, where if you said, you know, I'm really interested in climate change and I don't know how my portfolio actually advances or, you know, is detrimental to that, we can actually sort of X-ray your portfolio and see what are the, you know, of the funds that you have in there, what are the positions, what are the companies, and how do they actually impact climate change, and as well as any other sort of impact goals. So absolutely today you can. Also, because I think you have to realize that one can, as an investor, you can have a significant impact on climate change, not only through investing in a clean energy stock, right? I mean, if you think about, you know, if you think about a consumer product goods company that is revolutionizing their sourcing and doing more local sourcing rather than, you know, taking something from one continent, shipping it somewhere else, wrapping it in plastic and shipping it back to sell, but instead doing local sourcing, doing less with packaging. There's so many different ways. And one of the things that we really started doing when investors said we really care about this is saying we have to look not just at the industry, but first of all, within an industry, which are the players that are better or worse in terms of an emissions and a sustainable perspective, but then also what are all the different sort of business models? And so there's any number of ways. And I would really encourage investors who are interested in this to think sort of broadly and deeply about how we do this. On the policy side, though, I think, you know, really, you know, picking up on what Melanie was saying, and I can't say this enough, and, you know, maybe this, you know, maybe I am showing my roots having been, you know, a policy person during the Clinton administration. Enlightened policy and proactive corporate action go hand in hand, right? So if you were to go back over the past, however, you know, a couple of decades, and if you were to plot government policy incentives for investments in renewable energy, there often tends to be a little bit of a 4-year or 8-year sawtooth of when, you know, subsidies for renewable energy go up and down. And capital is very logical. So if you plot the capital, it does this. Right? They move together, right? And because capital is logical. And if you are trying to, sort of tilt a playing field to encourage a new technology of any kind, whether it's clean energy, those subsidies, those risk guarantees, those de-risking layers, those blended finance tools that Melanie was mentioning, those are all incredibly helpful. And we have to remember that legacy industries have those too, right? So again, exactly as Melanie said, it's not that you can just say, here's some de novo thing that has never had subsidies compared to something that has been entrenched for a couple of centuries with trillions of dollars of cumulative subsidies, and that one looks cheaper from today's perspective as of Tuesday, right? So we really have to say, look, we know we have, this year has sent us the clearest message we could possibly have that business as usual is not working, right? You're having people in Portland die of heat. You're having Germans die of rain. These are extraordinary, non-usual things. So it is time for businesses unusual, and policy is critical for setting goals, for tilting playing fields. And that's what we do with enlightened policy. That's why we all go to the polls and we vote, because we believe that elections have consequences. And the regulators and the leaders that we send, we hope that they are going to say, here's a common good, here's a public good, here's the global commons of what we need to survive. What are all the tools at our disposal, including ways to accelerate, incentivize, and speed the flow of capital towards the thing that we will advance the common good. So look, it's not going to be easy or simple, but this partnership that you have brought together today is absolutely what's going to happen. We can do everything we can to try to push private sector capital towards certain things, but until we can align that stack that really makes it sensible and attractive, we're not going to be able to get there at the speed that it needs to.
Thank you. Beautifully said. I have so many more questions. There are more questions coming in from the audience. Naoko, we have a question that was sent in, and I'm hoping that you can answer it. What is Japan's immediate go-forward plan, including a timeline for phasing out gas-fueled vehicles, transportation for the private, public, and commercial sectors? You don't have to answer it all, but if you just want to give a kind of a quick response over to the question about the phasing out of gas-fueled vehicles.
Yeah, actually, that the government has announced in its green growth strategy for carbon neutrality, which was approved actually the past June. It stated that they will actually take the very comprehensive measures to achieve 100% electric powered vehicle sales in a new passenger car sales by 2035. Sounds great, but there is also the discussion that what exactly it means by those electric vehicles. Does it include that the fuel cell vehicle, just only electric vehicle or fuel cell vehicle, but also the plug-in hybrid? So that the details need to be worked out. So there is a good goal, but then there are some maybe loophole which may need to be closed. So depending on how you see it. If I may just want to join that what was just discussed by the Melanie and also the Audrey, I think it's extremely important to find a way to really change the economic system. So something good or reasonable, or actually that the profitable today needs to be actually the non-profitable tomorrow. And that's why this the government policy, long-term vision and planned government policy is very, very important. In general, there are a lot of good incentives. But the incentive can bring only 20% of the market. We should find a way to how to, in a sense, penalize the 80% of the resistance forces. So this combination of that to providing incentive that show the good way forward, but also to find a way how the policy, the public planning can actually shift the system, and in a sense to make this 80% of business as usual to be non-profitable. I think that's something that we need to see. Otherwise, that how to govern this global goods, so the global commons, global public goods, will never really be systematized. And I think that it's important for us to recognize that if we want to see the world to be changing, that we need to find a way that this fundamental structure also may need to change. That the COP26 is coming, COP 15 is coming, and that why global public goods are so wasted because there is no price on this natural capital. I think that is that Audrey or Melanie very nicely mentioned. I think it's Melanie that the biodiversity is important, but it's wasted because there is no price on the nature of the biodiversity. So that all what we have been discussing today, how to systematize, institutionalize this good way forward, is to also find a way to adequately price those natural capital, which as for today are taken for granted and for free. Thank you, Caroline.
Thank you. And thank you all so very much. I want to just extend a really very special thank you to Audrey, to Naoko, to Melanie, and to Miho. You were all fabulous. Appreciate the depth with which you responded to my questions, to the questions that were put forward by the audience. I apologize that we did not get to all of the questions, but I sometimes think it's better to do less questions and really do substantive responses, which you all provided. So really grateful to have had this opportunity to moderate this panel and to have met the four of you, because you really are just all doing such significant, important work in your areas. So, so thank you. Thank you to the Japan Society for organizing this event. Critical topic. It is, as Melanie said in her opening remarks, we're about 5 weeks from the Conference of Parties 26. So we'll be watching what the United States and what Japan does. But we definitely have a great roadmap that's been laid out this evening. So thank you all very much. Everyone stay safe, and hopefully we'll see each other again. Thank you.
Thanks, Carolyn. Thanks for moderating.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you very
Bye,
much.
everyone.
Bye, everyone.
Thank you
Bye-bye.
so much. Bye-bye.